Mark Rogers TV, always talking up college football 24/7, 365. Of course, for you, the smart fan. And we bring in Steve Deace from Michigan Podcast. Please join him right there. You can catch him on pretty much all the major audio platforms as well as YouTube. Again, it's just plain Michigan Podcast. Follow him on Twitter at Michigan Podcast. Steve, how you doing this evening?
I'm doing well, Mark. How are you, man?
I'm doing just fine. So I caught your top 10. So you are a much braver soul than I, sir, because I am one of these guys that is predicting college football games at 11:58, the noon games. I'm also making those last-minute preseason projections on that Thursday or Friday night prior to the season. I just have to wait and just think it over. But you have got a top 10 for us that I'm going to let you explain a little bit. I'm going to read it off, then I'll let you explain your formula, and then I've got a few questions for you. So Steve has Clemson at number 1 for 2018. Alabama's number 2. Michigan State, did I read that right, at number 3? Washington 4. Ohio State 5. Wisconsin 6. Georgia 7. Oklahoma 8. Miami 9. And the Stanford Cardinal at number 10. So what's the formula, Steve? What's the secret sauce?
Well, throughout the course of the year, and I started doing my own college football preview my sophomore year in high school when a high school buddy of mine named Ryan challenged me when I didn't agree with what I was reading in the Athlon's and Lindy's college football preview when I was in the 10th grade. Said, hey, if you think you can do a better job, do your own. And so I put my own together. And for the 1988 college football season, and I predicted West Virginia and Florida State to play for the national championship. And Florida State was the preseason number 1 that year and lost to Miami in the opener. I think it was 31-0. West Virginia with Major Harris went undefeated and got to the national championship game. And so I thought, wow, I'm an idiot savant at this. I'm going to keep doing this. Okay, so I've done it every year since then. And I've always done my preseason rankings based on how I think my final ones, based on how I think the season will actually play out after I go through power ratings and everything and project all the games. I've never quite been able to equal that West Virginia feat, and I'm going on 30 years of doing these now, but I'm going to keep trying because I don't believe in going on a high note, Mark. I believe in this. The more predictions you make, sooner or later, you are likely to be right. Okay, so during the course of the off season, I will put together an initial top 10 that's really an approximation of just taking a look at who's got what coming back after the early NFL draft declarations. And then after the spring, I'll put together a full top 25 because the last several years, I think I watched about 30 or 40 spring games last year. There's so many of them that are available on television now. And while I don't think you can glean a lot about what a team can be through what you see in the spring, I do think you get a good framework of what a team probably can't be. When you see, for example, in a spring game, when you see that these are events that are really tailor-made to show off your quarterback, and when you see Jared Stidham light it up last spring the way he should, that's a good sign. When you see Wilton Speight struggle the way he should not, that was a no-no, bad sign, omen of what is to come, right? So I think spring games tell you more about who you aren't than maybe necessarily who you are. And then we get into the summertime and all the schedules and everything are finalized. The grad transfers, our version of free agency is kind of done. And then I will take a look at a 4-year roster foundation, which is a new metric I started introducing last year, where I go back and look at who you've recruited over the last 4 years and retained, and then, rate, 5 points for a 5-star, 4 points for a 4-star, right on down the line, and come up with who are the top ranked teams. And I did that for the first time last year. It was fascinating. My number 1 and 2 teams, when I added up the roster foundations, you know who they were? Alabama and Georgia were number 1 and 2. And, of course, those were the last 2 teams standing on January the 8th. So I'll put that together, and then I will literally go through every team's schedule 3 or 4 times, and I'll come up with a power rating where I'll get looking at who you have coming back and the caliber of schedule you play, what I think your win range is. Usually within 2 games. So I think you're an 8 to 10 win team, 7 to 9 win team. And if you have an experienced, proven playmaking quarterback returning, then I'll give you a bonus in your win range because I think there's a premium on that position. And then I have what I call coaching additions and coaching subtractions, meaning where I think if the talent is even in a big game spot, do you have a coach that I think rises to the occasion in those positions, or do you have one that doesn't? And for a lot of those schools, I don't even rank that at all because I think it's kind of neutral. And that helps me to project their win-loss records. And then in July, when I come out with my final preview, that's actually how I think the final regular season rankings will look at the beginning of December. And that's how I put these together. So when we talk about this initial top 10, these are really just 10 teams when I look at what they have coming back. I think are just an initial cursory review have sort of separated themselves. So outside of the top two, you're gonna have to really work to talk me out of not ranking Clemson and Alabama 1 and 2 when we get through to even into July and start projecting games. When you look at Clemson, Mark, I think it's possible. They are returning we didn't have, social media and the advanced analytics from Pro Football Focus and stuff back in the day when, Miami was returning Jerome Brown and Daniel Stubblefield and guys in the same defensive line, right? We didn't have that stuff back then. But I've never seen anything like what Clemson has coming back. We're talking 4 guys. We throw Dexter Lawrence in there, eligible for the 2019 draft. They're going to start 4 guys I think could be 4 first-round draft picks. At the very least, I think it's 3 first-rounders and a second-rounder. And then you look at the rest of what they have coming back. I think it's by far the best unit in college football returning next year. Is the Clemson defensive line. Reminds me of the Alabama offensive line in 2012. We started talking about that going into the year historically where it stood. And when you look at the defensive line position, in my view, that's the position that separates the men from the boys in college football, the good from the great from the elite. And bringing all those guys back, Christian Wilkins, Cleveland Farrell, turning down major paydays to come back and play college football. I think you're going to have a hard time talking me out of ranking them number 1. I like a lot of what Alabama has coming back, and much of it, of course, are those freshmen we saw in the national championship game, and nobody recruits better than them. But I also think at some point, Mark, we're talking now, what is this, 5 offensive coordinators in the last 16 games for them? I mean, there are 4 of them, I think. Another defensive coordinator change. They lose an entire secondary. They've got another whole slew of guys going pro early. At some point, that has to catch up to you a little bit, even if you're Alabama. And also keep this in mind. Nick Saban's only had 1 undefeated national champion at Alabama. As great as he's been, only 1 of his teams has gone unblemished. And the other reason I have Clemson number 1, I think it's a down year for the ACC next year. They've kind of had this renaissance as of late. I don't really see another team in that league, with the exception of Miami, that I think on paper can even come close to challenging them. And obviously, even when the SEC is down, it is still quite a gauntlet. I think it's a much tougher road to hoe for Alabama than the ACC is for Clemson.
On the line with Steve Days from Michigan Podcast. And for those of you watching, focus on the content here. So I plead with you to focus on the content. I will clean this up as much as I possibly can in post-production, but listen to the conversation here. We are going about as old school as you can with Steve over the phone and over the microphone here. So hopefully everything comes out clean as it did our last go around. So Steve, I'm believing that Bryce Love lifting Stanford into that number 10 position would be one of the more crucial returnees among your list of 10. Where do you see the gaps in the 10? Where are the tiers? Are there obviously bunches of teams that were extremely ranked close together, and then others that you feel comfortable that this is a decided, not significant, but decided drop off here or there?
I think Alabama and Clemson are in their own tier, and then I think teams 3 and going down to 25-30. I think there's a lot of competitiveness in there. One of the things that struck me, Stanford is going to bring back, with Bryce Love coming back, they're going to bring back 16, 17 starters, but, Harrison Phillips gone, Justin Reed gone. The big names on their defense are leaving. So sometimes it's not always quality as much as it is quantity. So many teams in college football this year, Mark, are bringing back between 9 to 12 starters. Big name teams. That Oklahoma's in there. TCU is in there. Ohio State is in there. Georgia's in there. I mean, Georgia's entire defense has been decimated. They're arguably the best 1-2 punch in modern SEC history, certainly since you go back to Cadillac Williams and Ronnie Brown for, Auburn back in 2003. Certainly since then, at least, that's more than a decade. Those guys are gone. I mean, there are a lot of teams this year that are going to be looking at heavier than normal rebuilding projects, and we're going to be doing more projecting based on their recruiting prowess and unknown variables than we typically have done. Oklahoma is another one of those teams. I would put them in there as well. And I think for the second year in a row, I told you this last year, and it wasn't me saying this as a homer, but as a college football analyst. And you remember I told you last year that I thought when I looked at the 4-year roster talent foundation, Michigan was going to be the most fascinating team because of all the teams. I think they had, in my rankings, they had the 15th or 16th most talented roster in college football. Them and Penn State were pretty much back to back, but they had by far the highest percentage of their talent in their freshman and sophomore classes. Mark, it was 73% of their roster talent points were in the recruiting classes of 2017 and 2016. And I told you then, I thought it was going to be, you remember me saying this, I thought it was going to be fascinating to see if Harbaugh could do in 2 classes with a massive, on-the-fly rebuild, what we see Dabo Swinney and Urban Meyer and Nick Saban and these guys with more time to build a roster doing on a perennial basis. Well, we got our answer. The answer is no. Now the issue for Michigan, the reason I think they're the most interesting team in the offseason, again, Mark, is their situation is the reverse of what they had before. On paper, they're going to have a far more stable and more talent. I look at my top 10 teams. On paper, Michigan will have, in terms of its overall returning starters, Letterman returning, 4-year talent foundation, they will have a better roster than Michigan State, than Wisconsin, than Georgia, than Oklahoma, than Stanford, probably right around where Miami is. But we know they have a huge gaping hole at the quarterback position. And we saw how that undid and unraveled their season this year. And I think it's really hard, and I say this as a Michigan fan, but I think it's really hard until we know what the eligibility is of Shea Patterson. I think it's really difficult to even attempt to project with the caliber of schedule they're playing where they're going to be. Because, I mean, Michigan has Michigan State on the road, has Ohio State on the road, Wisconsin at home. They open up on the road at Notre Dame. And I think something you and I will talk a lot about this offseason is I think by far the most important week 1 game this year. There was a lot of talk last year about that Texas A&M UCLA game, and was that a loser leave town match for the 2 coaches, and they both ended up getting fired anyway. Now, I think short of a losing record, there's no chance Michigan's going to fire one of its greatest living players for only winning 75% of his games. That's not going to happen. Okay. But in terms of next season and the way it unveils itself, the loser of that Michigan Notre Dame game, it could be in trouble. And if you look at the offseason Notre Dame is having, it's a rough one. It lost. I think there's been 2 coordinator hires in the last 2 years in college football that saved the head coach. Joe Moorhead saved James Franklin's job, and I think Mike Elko saved Brian Kelly's job. And both those guys are now gone. And the guy that's taken over for Moorhead is the guy that Moorhead took over for at Penn State already. And now you have Elko, who basically saved Brian Kelly's job. He's gone. They may lose their offensive coordinator. They lost their top 2 offensive weapons, and St. Brown and Josh Adams, and then the guys that they were grooming behind them, they just kicked out of school this week. They're having a rough offseason there at Notre Dame. And if you look at historically when Michigan and Notre Dame used to play on an annual basis, when Notre Dame lost to us, they almost never ended up winning double-digit games that season. So, and the other thing, too, to remember, Brian Kelly, I think, is going into year 9. Even the best of Notre Dame football coaches don't typically last more than 10 years because of the grind of that job. So I think for those 2 high-profile schools, the 2 winningest programs in the history of the sport, renewing that rivalry on September 1st, primetime on NBC, whoever walks out of South Bend as a loser is probably going to look at the rest of their schedule. I mean, Notre Dame still has Virginia Tech, Florida State, USC, Stanford, okay? Michigan, we've already talked about the rest of their schedule. Whichever fan base walks out of there with a loss is going to be looking at each other going, uh-oh. On the other hand, whoever wins that game is looking at the rest of their schedule similar to the Georgia Notre Dame game last year. When Georgia walked out of South Bend last year and said, hey, we've arrived. If Michigan wins that game, then I think they look at each other and say, last year was a fluke. But if they lose that game and then they have to hear again, they haven't won against a ranked team on the road since 2006, that mentally gets to you. I think that is a huge game next season for both teams.